Well, it is good to be back in familiar territory. I loved Trinity. I love the Deerfield and Chicago area, so I'm very glad to be able to come here. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for allowing me to be part of your chapel service, your final chapel service, and your Advent service. The well-known American author Mark Twain used to take great pleasure in highlighting that his birth in 1835 coincided with the appearance of Halley's Comet in the sky for the first time in 75 years. Commenting on that in 1880, he even predicted that he would die when Halley's Comet had completed its orbit and was next visible in the sky in 1910. And in his autobiography in 1909, he wrote, "I came in with Halley's Comet in 1910. It's coming again, I came in Halley's Comet in 1835. It's coming again next year, and I expect to go out with it. It will be the greatest disappointment of my life if I don't go out with Halley's Comet. The Almighty has said, no doubt, now here are these two unaccountable freaks. They came in together, they must go out together." Well, God apparently appreciated the humor because unbelievably, Mark Twain died at the very time when Halley's Comet was going around the sun. The coincidence between celestial phenomena and leaders' births, coronations, and other key moments could be regarded as very significant in the ancient world. If a future king's birth or coronation was attended by some astronomical wonder, that could be regarded as a wonderful omen for their reign and set them apart for greatness. Take, for example, one of Rome's most formidable enemies, Mithridates, the great king of Pontus. In his propaganda, he made much of the fact that two comets had appeared, one on the occasion of his birth in the year 135 BC, and one 15 years later at the time of his coronation. These, he claimed, heralded his greatness. In 44 BC, during the games in celebration of Julius Caesar's life, a tremendously bright comet was visible in Rome. And it was regarded by the majority of the population of Rome as being an indication that Julius Caesar had been received among the divinities. And we're told that Caesar Augustus, who was his chosen heir, took it as a wonderful omen for himself personally and his future career. In each of these cases, a real celestial phenomenon occurred at a birth, a coronation, or some other key moment, and it was regarded as a wonderful portent. Well, the text that we turn to talk about the star is Matthew chapter 2, and that's the Star of Bethlehem. Today, the star is often overlooked. In fact, in one survey of Christians in England, only one half even mentioned the star when they were asked to summarize the Christmas story. And all too often, the star for us has got a kind of sentimental, kind of romanticized aspect to it. We like to see it on our Christmas cards over the Magi in the images. But the Star of Bethlehem was much, much more than that for Matthew. For Matthew, it was an amazing phenomenon that demonstrated powerfully, unequivocally, and specifically that Jesus was the promised Messiah. The celestial events that attended the birth and death of Mark Twain and the birth and coronation of Mithridates, they pale into insignificance compared to what Matthew describes as occurring at Jesus' birth. Now, I've been looking at the star over the last decade or so, and my goal this morning is to introduce you, as for the first time, to the glorious Star of Bethlehem. So you're drawn into the nativity story in a fresh way, and you're taken aback by the power of God as displayed in the heavens. Let's quickly work our way through first the story of the star as told by Matthew. What did this star do to guide a group of astronomers from their homeland in the east, hundreds of miles all the way to Judea, to Jerusalem, and then ultimately Bethlehem? Now, the first thing I want you to notice about the star, story of the star in Matthew chapter 2, is that the star appeared. Now, Matthew tells us that when Herod met with the Magi, he was strangely eager to know when the star first appeared. Now, if you're reading the story closely, you'll find that that is very peculiar. Well, because when the Magi come to Jerusalem, what do they ask? They say, "Where is he who's been born King of the Jews? For we have seen a star at its rising and have come to worship him." So the Magi clearly are taken aback by what happens at the rising, and they regard that as coinciding with the Messiah's birth. But Herod is interested in the first appearance of this star. And we're told that the Magi were able to tell him precisely when the star first appeared. Now we know that they told him that the star had appeared over a year beforehand, because Herod, when he gives the order to slay the male infants of Bethlehem, he slays not only infants in their first year, but also in their second year, based upon the time that the Magi told him the star had first appeared. So what does this tell us? It tells us that the star originally was absent from the sky. And then at one point, at one particular day, it was first spotted by the Magi. They took a record of that first observation. That was the star's first appearance. And that was a wonderful moment for them, no doubt. Back in July of 1995, Tom Bopp, a factory manager from Glendale, Arizona, was out doing some stargazing, and he was looking at the galaxies, and he tells a story of how he's praising God at the wonder of his creation. And in the edge of his telescope field of view, he spotted a little blurry glow at the edge, just right at the corner. And he looked it up in his star atlas, but he couldn't find it. And then, following it over the next couple of hours, he noticed that this little blurry glow moved. Well, he knew what that meant. That meant it was a comet. A new comet, the first appearance of a comet. And when the Central Bureau that registers new comets and asteroids informed him officially that it was indeed the first sighting of a previously unknown comet, Tom Bopp danced around his kitchen, whooping and cheering in sheer delight. And because he was the discoverer of that comet, it was actually named after him, hence the name Comet Hale-Bopp. Needless to say, over the following months and years, he followed that magnificent comet's progress over with pride and with joy, feeling a sense of personal ownership of the comet, as it wowed the whole world, becoming the most photographed and observed comet in history. How cool was that? Similarly, the Magi, as the star's discoverers and as good astronomers, no doubt were fascinated by this new entity, charting its course across the sky on a nightly basis over the following months. Now, the next major event I want you to notice is the rising. That's what we've already mentioned. The Magi say in verse 2, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star at its rising and have come to worship him." Now, the word rising is actually a technical astronomical term. It refers to a planet, a comet, a star, which after being invisible because it's too close to the sun, because the sun bleaches out the surrounding sky, it then reemerges over the eastern horizon just before dawn, and the sun bleaches it out again. That moment is called a rising, and it was regarded as the most important moment in a celestial body's career. Whatever breathtaking and extraordinary thing that the star did in connection with its rising clearly stunned the Magi and seemed to communicate powerfully to them a lot of information. Evidently, they prompted them to turn to the Hebrew Scriptures in order to come to some understanding and to come to the conclusion that this indeed was something prophesied in the Bible. And the Magi came to a firm conclusion that this entity was disclosing that something momentous had happened on earth. The Jewish Messiah had been born. In fact, so compelling was this that the Magi became 100% certain that right then and there in Judea, the Jewish Messiah was a baby, a newborn baby. And they decided to undertake a brutally long and exacting journey to find and to worship him. And they bought special, expensive gifts to bring him, revealing just how highly they esteemed him. The next thing I want you to observe about the star is that as the Magi left Jerusalem, having met with Herod and found out that the Messiah's birthplace was Bethlehem, just a 5 or 6 mile journey southwards, the star was in the southern sky in front of them, going before them to Bethlehem, effectively ushering them there. And you can imagine what a wonderful experience that was for the Magi, because this star that had launched them on this momentous mission, this pilgrimage, was actually going to be there. It was there for the final stage of this journey. And as they got closer and closer to this divine Messiah and felt the holiness of that, the star was there reinforcing the divine cause. And then finally they get to Bethlehem, and the Magi face the daunting task of locating the baby Messiah. But the star climaxed its display, we read in Matthew, on that final night by, from the Magi's perspective, standing over one particular house in Bethlehem, pinpointing it as the location where the baby Messiah was, evidently with a precision greater than any GPS. The Magi knew that the baby Messiah was in the house even before they entered it. And when they went in, they fell down in worship before the baby king and presented him their gifts. So putting it all together, the star was completely absent from the sky. Then at one point it appeared, and the Magi took note of it. That was the first appearance. Then some months later, the bulk of a year later, there's this dramatic rising. And then a couple of months later, when they get to Judea, they see the star going in front of them in the southern sky, and then finally climaxing by standing over one particular house. That is the story of the star as told by Matthew. A powerful, dramatic, cosmic, momentous story, unprecedented in the annals of human history. Now I want us to move on from the story of the star to consider the significance of the star. Matthew makes it clear that the star did not evoke the same response from everyone. Neither, incidentally, did that comet we mentioned earlier, Comet Hale-Bopp, the great comet of 1997, which wowed the world for many months. For most people, this comet Hale-Bopp was little more than a curiosity in the sky. Better than Halley's Comet had been 10 years before, but really just a curiosity. But for members of the Heaven's Gate cult, so-called, on March the 22nd and 23rd, they regarded themselves as beaming themselves up to an alien spacecraft which they thought was trailing the comet, and they committed suicide, 39 of them. But for Tom Bopp, the discoverer, the comet was a magnificent gift from God for him personally. It completely transformed his life. Not only did he quickly become famous across the world, but he was suddenly in such great demand as a lecturer, speaking about Hale-Bopp and comets generally, that he was actually able to quit his job. The fact that it was the very first comet he'd ever observed only intensified his ecstasy and wonder at this majestic comet. Similarly, the significance of the Star of Bethlehem was perceived in different ways by different people. Take Herod the Great. The star had evidently been of no serious interest to him until the Magi arrived in Jerusalem asking where the newborn Messiah was. To Herod, who we know believed in astrology, this was terrible news. And if you read the history of the period, you will know that he cared only about one thing at this stage of his career, and that is establishing the succession so that his dynasty lasted long into the future. He was not about to accommodate a rival, and he was certainly not going to tolerate a major threat to his dynasty. And if we're paying attention, we see that Herod developed a two-pronged strategy to kill the Messiah. Plan A, targeted assassination. It relied on duping the naive Magi so that they returned to tell him precisely where the Messiah was, and then Herod could kill him. If for whatever reason the Magi didn't return, then Plan B was the cruel slaughter of every male infant in Bethlehem from the date that the Magi said that the star had first appeared. The double-pronged plan looked foolproof. And it is amazing hard-heartedness for the king of Judea, effectively taking on God by trying to kill his Messiah. Even using information derived from the writings of God's prophets in God's word against God. Even using information derived from the star which was announcing the Messiah against the Messiah. And even daring to commit a terrible atrocity by slaughtering the male infants of Bethlehem. But of course, thank God that Herod did not succeed, because God intervened through a dream to warn the Magi not to return to Herod to give him the location of the child. That thwarted plan A. And then God intervened through another dream to urge Joseph to take Jesus and Mary quickly to Egypt. And that thwarted plan B. And not long afterward, God struck Herod down with a mind-bogglingly excruciating illness that ended up taking his life. Now, you might have thought that the people of Jerusalem, that the occurrence of the prophesied sign that was the key to Jerusalem achieving its greatness and God's purposes, that they would have been thrilled that the Messiah had been born. But astonishingly, no, they cherished the status quo, the relative stability and prosperity of Herod's reign. And they didn't want the boat rocked. Well, what about the biblical scholars? You might have thought that the biblical experts, the ones who knew all about the biblical prophecies about the Messiah and that he was going to be born in Bethlehem, that they would have been trying to beat the Magi down to Bethlehem to worship the Messiah. But astonishingly, they were so spiritually cold and indifferent to God's agenda that they stayed put. Surprisingly, perhaps, it is pagan, Gentile astrologers, most likely from Babylon, that are the only ones in the story to grasp the remarkable significance of the star. And they evidently regarded it as the most important astronomical phenomenon ever, as marking the most incredibly momentous event in Earth's history, the birth of the divine Messiah. God himself in human flesh, the one prophesied in the Hebrew Scriptures, the one destined to reign over the whole world. And their choice of gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, recalling Old Testament oracles about the Gentile pilgrims coming to Judea to pay homage to the Messiah in the future age. And clearly the Magi felt like they were forerunners of those future pilgrims. And they were eager to demonstrate their own willing submission to this future king's royal authority. Moreover, they were certain that the star was speaking specifically to them, calling them to embark on an extremely long, difficult, and dangerous journey across a barren, rock-strewn desert notorious for its bandits in order to find and worship this newborn king. They must have faced derision and criticism for this radical decision to travel so far in search of a baby king based on observations of a star. And it must have required faith and courage to gather the provisions, make arrangements for the travel, and set out for Judea. And of course, when they got to Jerusalem, they must have been troubled to learn that there was no one there who knew where the baby Messiah was. And even after they discovered the location, the town of the Messiah's birth, they still faced the prospect of a needle in a haystack search through the entire Bethlehem area. But they persevered in faith that God would enable them to complete their divinely sanctioned mission. And as they set out from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, the star that had disclosed to them the fact and the timing of the Messiah's birth ushered them to Bethlehem, and then awesomely pointed out the very house where the Messiah was, identifying Jesus as the Messiah. How powerfully had their decision to follow that star's guidance been vindicated. And so in ecstasy, the Magi fell down in awe and worship before baby Jesus and presented him with their luxury gifts. The question Matthew would pose to us today here is, how will we respond to the star and to God as he continues to advance his kingdom purposes on this rebellious earth? With hard-hearted hostility, like Herod? With complacency, opting for the status quo and for financial stability, like the people of Jerusalem? With detachment, indifference, and even cynicism, like the theologians? or with faith and obedience, heeding his call, following his lead, like the Magi. Let's all determine to play a positive role in the grand drama of salvation, ushered in by the star. And let's make sure that our lives count, just like the Magi's did. Well, we've looked at the story of the star. We've looked at the significance of the star. And finally, since the star was celestial in nature, we also have to look at the science, I think, of the star. What precisely was it? Matthew gives us plenty of information about the star, more than enough for us to identify what it was. I want you to see first that Matthew gives clear indications that the star was a real astronomical body. The Greek word star indicates that. It can be used of a star, a planet, a comet, or a meteor. As we've already mentioned, the word rising itself implies that an astronomical body is in view. And that the Magi were record-keeping astronomers who were able to tell Herod the precise date when the star first appeared. That confirms that. There's no basis for believing the star was anything other than a real astronomical phenomenon. That is God acting in his capacity as the Lord of the heavens and the creator of the earth had the heavens signal the dawn of salvation. So what then is the star? What astronomical body matches a description? It appears, it remains observable for over a year. It has a meaningful and dramatic rising in the eastern sky. And then within a couple of months of that, it's shining in the southern sky to guide the Magi to Bethlehem. And then finally, later that night, standing over one particular house to reveal the location of the Messiah. Needless to say, many hypotheses and theories have been put forward. Some of you will be familiar with the DVD documentary by Rick Larson, a U.S. attorney, who claims that the planet Jupiter, in various conjunctions it was having with Venus in the years 3 to 2 BC, that was the Star of Bethlehem. Unfortunately, it actually is a very, very flawed view. For one thing, Jupiter, whose movements were entirely predictable in the 1st century BC, cannot have a first appearance. And in the years 3 to 2 BC, when he says everything's happening, it did not have a rising. And moreover, the date which Larson's forced to go to for Herod's death is 1 BC, but that is almost certainly not when Herod died. He died in the spring of 4 BC. So there are many problems and many others besides those I've just mentioned. What about the supernova view that was favored by the previous pope? This idea that there's a super bright exploding star which coincides with Jesus' birth. The problem is we would have remnants of that nebula from around that time if that was the case, and we don't. Besides, no ordinary fixed entity, whether a star or a supernova, could pull off what the star did, and that is moving from the eastern morning sky to the southern evening sky within the course of a couple of months. If you take Matthew's account seriously, there is only one plausible candidate for the Star of Bethlehem, and that is a comet. It's the only candidate that fits what Matthew says, what the church father Ignatius says, what the other early Christians in the first 2 centuries said, and Origen in the 3rd century explicitly states that the star was a comet. But what are comets? Without going into it too much, comets are simply icy dirt balls or dirty snowballs, really, really dirty snowballs that travel around the sun in very long, elongated oval orbits. And as these bodies, which are full of these chemicals that are very reactive, as they get closer and closer to the sun, they begin to react more and more to the sun's presence, and they blast off fountains of dust and gas, which end up making these very small, insignificant little snowballs look majestic and bright. They can become the brightest thing in the night sky, the longest and biggest things in the night sky. They can become brighter even than the full moon. And for the ancients, comets were completely unpredictable. They understood almost nothing about them, when they would appear, where they would move, when they would rise, when they would change in brightness or size or form. And interpreting their meaning, well, that was difficult because they didn't stick to the zodiacal constellations which the sun and the moon go through. So they looked at what they looked like, because comets can have all these strange forms. And they looked at where in the sky, what constellation the comets were moving through, and how they seemed to be engaging with them. And they looked at the timing of the comet. So what is the evidence that convinced me that the Star of Bethlehem genuinely was a comet? Well, I can't go into all of it now. I can only highlight a few. I encourage you to get the book because, honestly, it's very exciting. It was a very exciting journey, and there's so much stuff that you guys will enjoy. First, only a comet can do what we mentioned earlier, that's move from the eastern morning sky to the southern evening sky within a short time frame. Why? Because it's hurtling through the inner solar system, and it's especially fast when it's near the sun. So it's going through all the other stars, and therefore can do that. No other body can do that. Second, the sudden appearance of the star and its long visibility for over a year, that can only be one of two entities, a supernova, we've already ruled that one out, or a great and large comet like Comet Hale-Bopp. Hale-Bopp was visible to the naked eye for 18 months. And that's very similar to the Star of Bethlehem, obviously. Only a comet, moreover, can do things that are surprising and extraordinary in connection with a rising. Most risings of astronomical bodies are very unimpressive visually and have no real meaning because they happen predictably. But a comet, you see, because it's coming close to the sun, it's reacting to the sun's presence, it's flaring up, it's becoming large, it's becoming long, and it's becoming extraordinarily bright. That is a big clue, the word rising, as is a first appearance in the 1 year. In fact, many of the great comets of history are typically making their close pass by the sun and have a rising or a setting, which is because they're so close to the sun at that point. Fourth, the language that Matthew uses of going before travelers and standing over a particular location, that language is used of comets in the ancient world. Anyway, as I say, there's so much more we could say. That's just a tip of the iceberg, if you want to use an inappropriate metaphor. So, okay, let's say it is a comet. But which comet? Some astronomers have said maybe it's Halley's Comet. Halley's Comet appeared in 12 BC, but we know about how long it was visible. It was only visible for a couple of months. It never had a rising, and it never appeared in the southern sky, so we can dismiss that. Others have thought, well, there's one of the few records remaining from Chinese records. There's a 5 BC comet. Well, could it be that one? Well, the problem with that is it was only present for 70 days, and it didn't rise. So what comet could it have been there? One of the things I discovered, guys, in my research is that people that were investigating the Star of Bethlehem just had not taken the care to realize that the vast majority of astronomical records from the ancient world are lost. And when it comes to comets from that period from 50 BC to 50 AD, you would expect there to be about 87 on average comets during that period visible to the naked eye. But during that period, we only have Chinese records mentioning 10 or 11, and then we have a bunch of scattered references in Greco-Roman literature to another 10 or 11, which don't even overlap. That tells you that we know we have very few records. So then what we're forced to do is allow Matthew then to give us the information about this. There's a very interesting thing. Those comets that we do have record of, the reason we have record of them is because the historian saw a particular significance for the writing of his story or for the ideology. And so they preserved it for that reason. Josephus actually records a magnificent comet in the year roughly probably 66 AD. And the reason he mentions it is because it looked like a sword over Jerusalem in the run-up to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Now, that comet actually, to be visible for a year, that means it was a magnificent comet in the same league as Hale-Bopp, and very similar, of course, to the Star of Bethlehem. And yet, were it not for Josephus, we would have no record of that magnificent comet. Similarly, the Star of Bethlehem was a magnificent body which was preserved only because the Christians perceived the messianic significance of it. How much time do I have left there? But okay. So, then we come to the big question. If we think and conclude that the star is a great comet, like Hale-Bopp, the question we have to ask is, what on earth could this star have done to fully persuade these magi that 550 miles away across barren wilderness, they can find and worship the newborn Messiah, and actually worship him, meaning they believe he's God. What on earth could the star have done to communicate all that information? Because I guess it's a key question that's almost never asked. Now, back in 2011, as it was dawning on me that the star had to be a comet, I became convinced that there's a biblical text, Revelation 12, that held the key to this great mystery. There we find the nativity story told, but in astronomical terms, portrayed as a sign playing out in the sky with the sun, the moon, the stars, meteors, constellations, all actors. And we see a woman constellation, Virgo, the Virgin, playing the part of the Virgin Mary and Israel, pregnant and then in labor and giving birth to the Messiah. Now, as someone that has a real research interest in Revelation, I could see that scholars and commentators had a very hard time explaining the astronomical framing of that nativity story at the beginning of Revelation 12. And it dawned on me that there really is only one explanation of that. And that is that Revelation is informing us what was happening on the earth, namely the birth of a special child to a virgin, was being broadcast on the celestial IMAX screen of the sky, with the constellation, the Virgin, playing the role of the Virgin on earth. And that raises the question, and I better bring this to a close, through what celestial body could play this part? Well, my research, I was working through with a lot of the top scholars and in astronomy. The answer is, guys, there's only one body that can cause that to come alive, and it is a comet. Not just any comet, a large Hale-Bopp type comet that has the exact same profile as the Star of Bethlehem deduced from Matthew. And that this comet is effectively interacting with Earth, because Earth is moving on its orbit, the comet is moving on its orbit, and the two, amazingly through a geometrical magnificence, it is able to stay in the same part of the Virgin's womb, growing as a baby and then eventually being born. And as this comet produces this wonder, the Magi are able to see someone truly incredible is being born, and they turn to Old Testament prophecies, including the prophecy of Balaam in Numbers 24:17. The big question is, to summarize it very quickly, would the comet that did that end up doing what the Star of Bethlehem did, having a magnificent rising and then be over in the southern sky a couple of months later and then standing over a house? Big question. I worked on that for ages. It took me a long time to come up with the orbit that finally did. Working with scholars, it sounds strange to say come up with an orbit, but there's enough data in Revelation to actually create an orbit. And when you do, you find, wow, guys, at its rising, it would have appeared larger and brighter than the full moon. It was then when the baby appeared in the Virgin's womb and the nativity drama began to unfold. So Revelation 12 is describing a rising. And then when the comet moves past Earth, it would have been regularly setting each night in the west, right in front of the Magi as they went westwards to Judea. And as they trekked toward Bethlehem on the final night of their journey, it would have gone before them in the southern sky in the exact direction of Bethlehem. And finally, as they were in Bethlehem looking for the infant, it would have become a magnificent pointer as it set in the west to highlight one particular house from the Magi's perspective. And really, in terms of astronomy, for those two texts, Revelation 12 and Matthew 2, to be perfectly complementary is astonishing, because there's so few comets that overlap or do anything like the other. Now, if you want to know more, it's obviously I've had to go quite quickly through this. Please get the book, The Great Christ Comet, Revealing the True Star of Bethlehem. I think we're selling it for $10, which is a travesty, so exploit that while the offer's on. It should be $40. But I want you to remember, guys, you can trust the Gospels, because more people scoffed at and ridiculed the story of the star than anything else in the Gospels, and yet it ends up fully authenticated. It underlines that even when people try to deprive God of his sovereignty and lordship over the heavens, and oftentimes as atheistic scientists try to steal the glory from God, it reminds us he's the one who programmed the orbits of the planets and the comets. He's the ultimate mathematician, scientist, and astronomer. And most importantly, it reminds us that Jesus is the promised Messiah. Because other people had claimed that a star appeared in conjunction with their birth or coronation, but never a majestic body like this, and especially not one that not only marked the occasion, but identified him in particular as the one in view, as the Messiah. The universe powerfully, unequivocally, and specifically declared that Jesus was the promised Messiah. Now go and enjoy a wonderful Christmas season as I close in prayer. Lord, we want to bow before you as earth's King. We want to acknowledge you and honor you. And we want to give you praise that the heavens declared that you indeed, not only in general terms are the Creator, but you are the Savior of the world. May this Christmas season be a meaningful one, a powerful one, one where we experience you and your wonder and the historicity of the story in a new way. In Jesus' name, amen.